You just may have to come back to yourself and remind yourself, no, I forgive them still. I step into this forgiveness. I release that debt, and I'm going to choose right now, even in the midst of this pain, even in the midst of this anger, to put my attention on the faithfulness of God to me in this moment, and the future of where he's guiding and directing. Doesn't mean you reconcile that. Maybe that's not what God's called you to. Maybe that's not his plan for your life. But I can tell you this, without choosing forgiveness again and again and again, you will never actually experience the resurrection of your purpose and your dreams.
Created on purpose and for purpose.
Hey everybody, it's time for another episode of the Daron Earlewine podcast. Can't wait to jump into this next question that you guys sent in as a part of this frequently asked question series we're doing this summer. And once again, just want to say thank you guys so much for downloading this episode, wherever you watch or listen to the podcast, YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, wherever you consume your content. Thanks for being a part of the Daron Earlewine community. And as I say often on the podcast, we'd love to hear from you, whether it's more questions for maybe a future frequently asked question series, or just something that's hitting you. Maybe you're listening to some older episodes and you're thinking, man, I really have some questions about this. You can always email me, Daron, D-A-R-O-N, Daron at blackbirdmission.com. You can also reach out through the website, DaronEarlewine.com. You can reach out through direct message me on all the socials, or you can also text 317-550-5070. And I want to jump into this question that came in as part of this series, and it's a doozy, all right? Let's jump right in. It says this: how do you forgive when you've been betrayed by a spouse? All right? So we're not screwing around on the FAQ series, and neither were you guys when you were sending in these questions. And I want to answer the question specifically, but also even a little more broad, because the reality is, I think it's got to be top three, and this is just in my brain. I didn't Google this for stats or ask AI, right? But I would say one of the top three things, if not very possibly top two things, that are going to determine your future. They're going to determine your ability to actually live life to the fullest that Jesus wants you to live. One of the top two things is going to be unforgiveness. And so this question comes through very specifically of how do you forgive when you've been betrayed by a spouse, which is, absolutely gut-wrenching, right? This is a very deep level of betrayal and pain at the spousal level. But the reality for us all, if you've not experienced that, I think one of the most common, unfortunate circumstances that we walk through as human beings is the need to forgive. And I think as we look at through our life, whether it's something that's this big as in a spousal betrayal, or it's something that may seem a little more trivial to you, I think if you look at your life, I want you to start asking ask yourself the question, like, as you look at the scoreboard of your life, what's winning? Instances of forgiveness or levels of bitterness? Because it can be a spouse, but I think about how many things come at us in a weekly or a daily or a monthly, rhythm of things that can stir up bitterness, that can stir up anger, that can stir up what begins to become rage or contempt, or and these things will ruin our whole life. They'll ruin our whole outlook on our future and our present, and even on our past. Think about it in your life, right? Like, you don't get the promotion that you were wanting. You feel betrayed by your boss. When you have kids, this is one of the things I think it's difficult when raising kids, is that you can take on offenses, for your kids, from your kids, but all things wrapped around to it. Your kid doesn't make the team, right? That it was maybe it's a whole political situation. You didn't know the right people, whatever. And we get so wrapped up in our kids' accomplishments and what they do. And all of a sudden you've got problems with your spouse. You got problems at work. Now your kid gets cut from the travel team. Now maybe this thing doesn't happen. And maybe the church that lets you down. So people let us down all of the time. right? You find out that some of your best friends are hanging out, but for some reason they don't invite you to hang out. And you find out there's a text message going around behind your back about what might be happening over here. We go through scenario after scenario after scenario. And if we're not careful, we can begin racking up a scoreboard of resentments that absolutely dwarfs the scoreboard for forgiveness. And I think what can happen in that is it can become part of our ethos of our life. Am I a person who right? We talked about this, I think, before in a podcast, like ethos. I love the word. It's hard to say, but it looks cool even when you spell it. It's the spontaneous, reoccurring habits in your life. Okay, we've talked about it before. It's like brushing your teeth. Okay, you have a high value for oral health and having your breath not stink, right? So no one has to remind you to brush your teeth in the morning, I'm hoping. If they do, listen, we're going to have another podcast after this called Oral Health, right? Keep your teeth is what it's going to be called. No, but if someone has to remind you to brush your teeth every day, it means you don't have a value for all of those things. But you do, and so every day, there's even days that I brush my teeth and then I think to myself, did I brush my teeth today? Because it's just so much of a rote part of my life. And either holding on to bitterness or choosing forgiveness, I think can become one of those things. If I live a life of grace and forgiveness, what happens is it starts to become, now some of them are difficult, but it starts to become the spontaneous reoccurring habit of my life is that when I'm wronged, I choose forgiveness and I choose grace, okay? Same is true on the opposite end of it. You can get to a place where, and you've met people like this, I'm sure it's not you, okay? That it feels like they're walking through life like looking to get offended, right? Like their magnetic force of their life is towards resentment. I'm just looking for another person to hurt my feelings. I'm just looking for another reason for me to have proof that the world's not fair, which it's not. And what happens is you're around those people, and then you begin realizing, I don't know that I want to be around this person too long, because what happens is their resentment and the lack of forgiveness and grace in their life, it leads to resentment, it leads to anger, it leads to contempt, it leads to an environment around them that makes love, that makes peace, that makes mercy inaccessible. And I know that's not what you want. This question comes in specifically about how do you deal with forgiving a spouse? And what I want to say is the principles are the same, whether it's a spouse, whether it's a boss, whether it's a travel coach, whether it's a brother, whether it's a sister, the principles remain the same. And as I was thinking about answering this question, what came to my brain is actually one of my favorite chapters of my book, The Death of a Dream, Resurrecting Purpose When Life Doesn't Go as Planned. We spent last year, a good portion of last year, the first part of this year, going chapter by chapter through the book. If you haven't checked out those episodes, I want to highly suggest you do so. We just added some extra content, maybe some stuff that didn't make the editing process when we wrote the book and edited it. And you can go chapter by chapter through episodes. And we're about to release actually a small group curriculum that will be a video and audio based, where you could get together in a book club and actually go chapter by chapter with the book study. But one of my favorite chapters of the book is the chapter on forgiveness. And so I thought about that, and I thought, you know what, I want to re-highlight some of that because I think it could really help us in this moment. One of the scriptures that I think speaks to this is, I love the words of Jesus in the Beatitudes in Matthew 5:9, where he says it like this, from the Message paraphrase: "You're blessed when you can show people how to cooperate instead of compete or fight. That's when you discover who you really are and your place in God's family." I love that. As we just talked about, that ethos of your life. In your life, are you the kind of person who shows people how to cooperate instead of compete and fight? And there's no doubt that grace and forgiveness as a part of the spontaneous reoccurring patterns of your life are going to be true if that's the kind of person that you are. But it's so key, as that Jesus says in that second part there, that's when you discover who you really are, your place in God's family. And who are we? We're who God says that we are. We've talked about covenant a ton of times on the podcast. Is you understand that, right? You discover who you really are. You're a dearly loved child of God who has been forgiven, right? When you were an enemy of God, right? While we were still sinners, enemies of God, Christ died for us. We were extended forgiveness. That's who we really are. We're people who have received, we are recipients of divine forgiveness. That's how we get our place in God's family. Then the opportunity then for us is to actually extend what we have been already the recipient of. And I think it's when we lose sight of that fact that it becomes more and more difficult to actually forgive. In the book, it says this: one of the greatest obstacles to maturing into the weight of our calling is forgiveness, because it's so much easier to wallow in self-pity and anger, blaming the person who hurt you, than it is to trust the unbeaten path of forgiving those who have hurt you. And if you're not careful, you'll find yourself continually harvesting the pain of your past instead of reaping the sweet fruit of God's faithfulness. And I think that's a part of what makes it difficult, right? If you're not careful, you'll find yourself continually harvesting the pain of your past. When we're wronged by someone, right, that happens in a moment, and then we wake up the next day and we try to put the pieces back together of our life, whether it's our marriage, whether it's our friendship, whether it's something with our parents, whether it's something with our job. And the reality is we are still moving through life day by day, and this wrong, this betrayal is back in our past. And that can either become something that shapes and transforms us, or it can be something that tethers us to our past. And one of my favorite quotes that I've used a million times from Erwin McManus, right? He talks about that hope is found in the future. And it's not just from Erwin, it's all over the Bible, specifically in Hebrews, right? Is if we're going to be someone who lives with hope, the trajectory of our life has to be into our future. And if our whole life is being tethered, right, is being chained up to these betrayals or these hurts of our past, we will eventually find ourselves living with very little hope, because we can't hope for what's already gone, and especially when it's something that is hurt, something that has been a place of betrayal, something that has been a place of pain. And the life of Joseph is a big part of the theme of my book, and one of the most powerful stories. I mean, basically the Old Testament, right? The first book of the Bible, Genesis. I mean, you have the majority, or I guess at least half of that book, right, is dedicated to this life of Joseph. And there's so many amazing parallels with the life of Joseph and Jesus. But one of the most powerful moments, I think, in this idea of Joseph being able to come to a place of having these dreams, being betrayed by his brothers. If you don't know the story real quick, is basically Joseph had these dreams that God gave him where he saw wheat, these sheaves of wheat bowing down to him. And then he had another dream where the sun and the moon and like 11 stars were bowing down to him. And he interpreted those as basically God letting him know that his family would eventually bow down to him. He was going to be in a place of leadership. And these were dreams from God. These were dreams from God that I think he placed there to begin to give Joseph a vision of what his future would look like. And those dreams would eventually come true. That's the end of the story. The middle part of the story is something that Joseph would have never dreamed, would have never chosen, would have never wanted to have gone through. Because what happens is his brothers get sick of him. They hate him actually for his dreams. They hate him for the fact that he's the favorite son of his father. And so they plot to kill him. Then they decide to be merciful, not kill him, but sell him into slavery for 20 shekels of silver, which is about $200 American. And he's sent down to Egypt, to a foreign country, to be enslaved and work for a guy named Pharaoh and a leader named Pharaoh. And there's a lot of other things that happen with Joseph, right? The good thing is that God's with him through all these betrayals. He goes down to Egypt, and he's put in charge of Pharaoh's household. He thinks things are going to go great for his life. And then before you know it, Pharaoh's wife notices how handsome Joseph is. She makes 2 sexual advances at him. He resists the temptation. He's a man of character. She falsely accuses him of being inappropriate, and she's believed, and he's then put in prison. Now he's been betrayed by his boss. He's been betrayed by this friend. He's been betrayed by his brothers. Life in general just looks like it's conspiring to betray Joseph and move him so far away from the dreams he had for his life. It's not even funny. The interesting thing about the story, and now that we can see how all of it's unfolded, is God was actually at work in every one of these situations, setting Joseph up to be at a place where he would be able to be trusted with the weight of God's calling. God's macro purpose for Joseph's life was to set him up to become the leader of, really the leader of Egypt, to lead the country in a way where they were prepared for 7 years of famine so that God's people would not die of starvation, and neither would the Egyptian people. He was there to actually bring salvation in some ways, not spiritual, but physical salvation, life to this whole country. And God was preparing him. God was with him in that whole process. But we see a couple different moments, and one I want to bring our attention to here, where we see that I don't believe Joseph fulfills that purpose. I don't believe he steps into that sense of calling without the ability to forgive the betrayal of his brothers. And there's this amazing moment where Joseph's brothers find out, right, that there's food in Egypt. And so their dad sends them down there to try to get some food. And they think they send him out. They don't know. They don't know if he's alive, dead. They've not heard from him forever. And in chapter 42 of Genesis, right, it says, when Jacob learned that there was grain in Egypt, he said to his sons, why do you just keep looking at each other? Why do you just keep looking at each other? He says. He continues, I have heard that there's grain in Egypt. Go down there to buy some for us so that we may live and not die. Then 10 of Joseph's brothers went down to buy grain from Egypt. But Jacob did not send Benjamin, Joseph's brother, with them, with the others, because he was afraid that harm might come to him. So Israel's sons were among those who went to buy grain, for there was famine in the land of Canaan as well. Now Joseph was the governor of the land, the person who sold grain to all its people. So when Joseph's brothers arrived, they bowed down to him with their faces to the ground. As soon as Joseph saw his brothers, he recognized them, but he pretended to be a stranger and spoke harshly to them. Where do you come from? He asked. From the land of Canaan, they replied, to buy food. Although Joseph recognized his brothers, they did not recognize him. Now here's a moment, verse 9. This is powerful right here. Then he remembered his dreams about them. You have these moments all the time. Joseph's at this moment, right? You can just see it. Like he's there. He's seeing, God's, given him some favor. Things have worked out. He's been put in charge now. He's overcharged of all of Egypt. God's brought him out of the prison. He's seen God's faithfulness to them. And now here's this moment where for the first time in forever, he's standing face to face with the person of betrayal, right? And he's actually seeing his dream fulfilled. There they are bowing down before him. And Joseph says, then he remembered his dreams. And undoubtedly, there are moments, if you're living a portion of your life right now that does not look like you thought it would because someone has betrayed you, spouse, coworker, friend, brother, mom, dad, travel baseball coach, fill in the blank of your most recent betrayal. Because like I said, as I've been paying attention in life, it's not like these don't happen often. People are letting us down and in need of forgiveness from us all of the time. And so it's these moments, right, where we remember something triggers our mind. We remember I had a dream that was so much different than what my life was going to be. And in those moments, those are those trigger moments where we have to decide, it's a fork in the road, am I a person who has received forgiveness on the divine level and will take the risk to courageously extend it? Or in this moment, is this another time to put another notch on the scoreboard of resentment? Joseph remembered his dreams. So I wonder what it is for you. I wonder what those moments are for you. I joked around in the book, and I think I said it in the chapter breakdown we had, is that for a long time, tour buses were my trigger when I would remember my dreams. And my dream was to be in a band and travel the world, and man, that's one of the dreams that I never fulfilled, was going on tour on a tour bus. And there's still some times now where I'm driving. I just got back from New York, taking my youngest son up to play baseball up in Cooperstown, New York. Awesome trip. And the whole way back, for whatever, there was a handful of tour buses that went past. So one time I about wrecked the car because I'd turned around to see if it was a cool tour bus, right? And then every time I see it, I always make up a story in my brain. Wonder who's in that tour bus? Maybe that's Dave Matthews, you know what I mean? Or whatever it is. And for years after the betrayal that I experienced in my dream, these were a triggering moment. where I would see the bus and I would remember my dreams. And with Joseph, not only is he remembering his dreams, right? Here are the people who tried to destroy his life. And he's remembering these moments and he's having to make a decision. And this is, what kind of person am I going to be? So the question is, in this, like, what prepared Joseph's heart, right, for this moment? What prepared this moment for him to actually choose forgiveness instead of resentment? Because if you dive in this story, I want to suggest you do it. Read the whole last half of the book of Genesis. You're going to get all the ins and outs of this story. But Joseph has a little fun with his brothers. It's a great part where he screws around with them. He sends it back to his dad, but he puts silver in their bags so they look like they were stealing it, and they have to come back and they have to fess up and be like, come clean and be repentant. It's actually genius what Joseph does. But even though he kind of screws with his brothers in this process, what we see is it was before he came to this moment of remembering the dream, he had already chosen to forgive. He had already stepped into the process of forgiveness. So when he steps in this moment, even though he screws with them a little bit, you can see that he's not responding from a heart of spite. He's not responding from a heart of revenge. He's not responding out of a heart of resentment. He has become a person of peace. He's become a person of forgiveness. And here's what I think it is. I think it is for Joseph, and I think it is for us, it matters where we fix our attention. Do we fix our attention on the faithfulness of Jesus, right? The faithfulness of God, or on the failure of man? Because there may be a third way, but in my brain, when we're talking about betrayal, like you've been betrayed by your spouse, whether it's your husband or your wife, and maybe that was 6 days ago, maybe it was 6 months ago, maybe it was 6 years ago, and you're still at a place you're like, I cannot let go of the resentment I feel for how I was betrayed. And I would ask you the question, if it was 6 months ago, on a daily basis, what do you find yourself paying more attention to? The daily faithfulness, forgiveness, guidance, wisdom, compassion, love of Jesus, or on the unfaithfulness of that individual? Because whatever is consuming your mind most, whatever is consuming your thoughts most, it's consuming your emotions. And when your mind and your emotion comes together, it's going to consume your actions. It's going to become who you are. And what we see in Joseph's story is, in every situation where he's wrong, his brothers wrong him, then the Bible tells us that God was with him and set him up with Potiphar. Then Potiphar's wife wrongs him and he ends up in jail. And the Bible says, but guess what? God was with him. Right? Then he steps into this moment and God is with him to guide and direct him, and know that if you will focus on how faithful I've been to you, on how much I love you, and in our case, and Joseph didn't even have this ability to look through what we've received as recipients of the grace and forgiveness of God. We focus on the faithfulness of God. It doesn't excuse. I'm not saying we excuse what others do, right? We're not endorsing. We're not excusing. We're not defending. We're giving ourselves the gift of forgiveness. We focus on the forgiveness. We focus on the faithfulness of God, and then we begin to look in the future. That's where our hope is. Fortunately, unfortunately, I would say fortunately, I've had the privilege of getting to walk with many friends who've walked through the betrayal of a spouse. And it's not easy. It's not pretty. I wouldn't wish it on anyone. But in every one of those situations, I've seen some people really recover, find a lot of hope, find a future, see God bring amazing things from that betrayal, whether that was with something that was reconciled with that same spouse or something new in the future. But I can tell you this, that probably number one deciding factor of how someone comes out of that situation is the person's ability to put their focus on the faithfulness of God, not the unfaithfulness of the person who hurt them. And this is not a, hey, poof, there it was, magic trick. You know what I mean? I just thought that once and everything was great. This is something that you grind through. This is something that you fight through. This is something you get up every day and continue to remind yourself of the faithfulness of God, what you've received from him, and begin to extend that. And we see that in the life of Joseph. We fix our eyes on the faithfulness of God and we extend what we've received. But this is not easy. And I had a conversation this past week with a friend, and they're wrestling with this. And it's not specifically a spouse. It's a very close family member, and the person's struggling with substance abuse pretty aggressively. And they said, Darren, how do I know if I've forgiven? Like, I want to forgive. And the struggle they had, and this may be where you're at, is they don't think it's safe for them or their family, and maybe even for this family member, to reconcile a relationship right now. And so they're battling constantly and feeling guilty all the time, like they haven't really forgiven because they don't have any desire to reconcile. And that would apply, my guess, is if you're at a place where you've had betrayal from a spouse. And you say, you know what, this is what happened, and I don't want to be married to her anymore. I don't want to be married to him anymore. Like, this is a done deal. This was 5 years ago. This was 6 years ago, whatever it is. And I struggle because I don't want to go back there. I don't want to have that connection. In fact, I don't even want to see him anymore, right? Like, when I see him, I get angry. Why? It's like, Joseph, you remember your dreams. You have all these thoughts of how you thought your life was going to go before this thing happened. And I was able to sit down with this friend and talk about the fact that the reconciliation, right? That, and we've talked about this in the podcast. I feel like sometimes I'm such a broken record, but I feel like I just keep coming back to these things in my life because they're coming up in your life. Reconciliation is a two-way street, right? It's the reconnection of the friendship, the connection, the love. And we're not called in every situation to reconcile a relationship. We are called to be people of forgiveness. Forgiveness is a one-way street. And I was able to talk with this friend about the fact that they need to forgive, and that forgiving is releasing the debt that person owes them, right? Releasing the anger, releasing the resentment, releasing the bitterness from it. But that doesn't mean that they don't set up a strong boundary in their life and say, hey, listen, you don't get to be a part of this part of my life anymore. And I'm doing that to protect the people in my life, to maybe to protect you, to protect myself. Like, this is a loving decision for me to make. And this was not going to be reconciled, but I'm not going to allow the bitterness of unforgiveness to ruin my future. And what I encouraged, this friend with is, I'll encourage you today, is that sometimes we have to come to the place where we wake up and we tell ourselves, I forgive you still. Because your emotions, they can get crazy, can't they? Like, where you're at a place where it's just like you wake up and you remember your dream again. It's a bad day. It's a bad Wednesday. It's a bad Monday. And you remember what you wish you would have had and what you could have had. And all of a sudden, this grief, this anger, this stuff wells back up, and you start thinking things of like, whatever it is, pain, anger, sorrow. And you go, oh man, this is a negative emotion. I guess maybe I didn't forgive them. No, you just may have to come back to yourself and remind yourself, no, I forgive them still. I step into this forgiveness. I release that debt, and I'm going to choose right now, even in the midst of this pain, even in the midst of this anger, to put my attention on the faithfulness of God to me in this moment, in the future of where he's guiding and directing me. Doesn't mean you reconcile that. Maybe that's not what God's called you to. Maybe that's not his plan for your life. But I can tell you this, without choosing forgiveness again and again and again, you will never actually experience the resurrection of your purpose and your dreams. Joseph's life, it points us out, right? Because he gets to this place where eventually, I mean, it's an amazing end to his story. Where at the end of this whole situation, Joseph's relationship with his brothers is restored, is reestablished. His connection with his father is reestablished and resurrected, right? In fact, his whole family ends up moving down to Egypt, and Pharaoh and the whole Egyptian government, whatever, gives them a big piece of land and takes care of them. God blesses them so much, and he gives them such an amazing hope and a future that Joseph would have never imagined when he was first being betrayed by his brothers. But all of this does not happen without Joseph's ability to forgive. I mean, he could have been so mad, so angry. His brothers come down, they bow down. He's in charge of everything, and that's in the palace there of Pharaoh. He could have been like, you know what? I don't know who these guys are. I think they're thieves. Guess what? Hey, guards, come in, murder them right now, right? Execute them. And it would have been done in a heartbeat. He could have chosen revenge. You get to choose revenge. And I don't know how that plays out, but my guess is if he chooses revenge and murders all of his brothers, for one, he never has a relationship with his father again. And for two, I'm going to guess that God may have been like, hey, Joseph, now I don't think I can trust you to actually lead all of this because now you've become a murderer, right? His forgiveness actually paved the way for the resurrection of God's purpose in his life. After Joseph's family comes down, and I'll wrap it up with this. Joseph's father, Jacob, dies. And after he dies, the brothers see that the father was dead, and they start thinking, hey, what if Joseph holds a grudge against us and pays us back for the wrongs that we did to him? Right? So the dad dies, and like, man, maybe Joseph was only being cool, and he only forgave us for a moment because he was trying to be cool with dad. But now that dad's dead, I bet he's going to get mad again. He's going to remember his dreams. He's going to remember our betrayal. He's probably going to kill us now that dad's dead. And so they come up with a plan, right? So they send word to Joseph saying, your father left these instructions before he died. This is what you're to say to Joseph. I ask you to forgive your brothers the sins and the wrongs they committed in treating you so badly. Now, please forgive the sins of the servants of the God of your father. When their message came to Joseph, he wept. Like they can make up a story. Jacob didn't say that. Like they're making up a story. Hey, go tell him that dad said to be cool with us and forgive us because we made some sins there, but whatever, because we still don't believe that he actually forgave us. And I don't know everything that was in Joseph's weeping here. But here's what I think it was because of what he says here at the end of this passage. I think he began to weep because he knew he had already forgiven them. He knew it was real. And he knew it because his life was such a testament of the faithfulness of God, even as he walked through the valleys of the shadow of death in his life. Because here's Joseph's response. His brothers come and they throw themselves down before him again and say, we are your slaves. Here's his dream once again, them bowing down. Joseph says, don't be afraid. Am I in the place of God? You intended to harm me. But God intended it for good, to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. So then, don't be afraid. I will provide for you and your children. And he reassured them and spoke kindly to them. More redemption, more resurrection, more reconciliation, more peace, more joy, more mercy, flowing out of this fact that Joseph knew, no, God has been faithful this whole time. I will choose to forgive as he has forgiven me. And as that mercy and that grace flowed through, it brought about resurrection and hope in his life. So if that's where you are, I'm sorry. I'm sorry that you've walked through and you've experienced this pain through the betrayal of a spouse. But I also know that for everyone else that's listening or watching too, you've had a recent betrayal. You've had a recent hurt. You've had a recent thing that is threatening to allow bitterness to be the ethos of your life. And you can hold on to it if you want. God gives you the free will if you want to become a bitter, angry person. But you don't have to, because you have experienced the faithfulness, the forgiveness of God, and the freedom that you're looking for is to release that debt that the person owes you, and to do that day in and day out. Choose the fact of forgiving as fully as God forgave you, even if your feelings haven't caught up with it yet. And you may need to do that daily for a while. And I would say this too. This is not a journey that you can walk through alone, in my opinion. I would encourage you to surround yourself with fellow followers of Jesus that you trust, that know your story, that they can walk with you, that can help you, that can process this. I would also suggest you find a Christian counselor, somebody who is steeped in the Word of God and that could be a trusted Christian counselor to walk through this process and help you gain some of the coping skills, some of the thinking skills, some of the feeling skills that you're going to need to walk through this, because it's not easy. I'm not saying it's easy. I'm just saying it's the only direction to choose if you're going to experience hope in your future. So appreciate you guys tuning in. Hope that was encouraging to you. Hope it was instructive to you. If you have any follow-up questions, please don't hesitate to send them in. I'd love to answer them and just to continue to grow together. So hope you're enjoying this frequently asked questions series. We'll be back with answering another question next week. And until that time, remember, God's for you. He's not against you. He's near you. He's not far away. And he's created you on purpose and for a purpose. We'll talk to you guys next time right here on the Daron Earlewine Podcast.